The first text came in about 9:32 a.m. Sunday, and it said, "That was fabulous. Why don't we know that?" And then I got one about an hour later. "That was fantastic. Then that was amazing." And then some non-Catholic friends, "Wow, that was powerful." They had just learned something that you can't unlearn, is the way I put it. Well, it's one of those things you get hit between the eye and you go, well, can't unlearn that one. Wow, once you know it, heart starts racing. Then you start thinking, who needs to hear this? Who could I share this with? Who would appreciate what I just found out? But going back to that first text, there was also a little bit of being ticked. She was a little ticked. Why don't I know this? I know I found out about it several years ago. A friend of mine who's very much a God science guy. He sees the link between the two. They're not at war with each other at all. And he told me about this, and I went, wow, can't unlearn that, This was reawakened a few days back when I was talking to Ron Tesoriero on my Touched by Heaven podcast. It's episode 239, by the way, if you want to see this. But he brought it all back again, because what he's been doing for the last 30 years is studying the supernatural. And that could be Eucharistic miracles. It could be a bleeding Jesus statue. It could be someone with stigmata, whatever. But this began with this statue in Bolivia. And you hear something like this, like there's this statue and it's bleeding, and you go, yeah, right. Well, who's trying to fake what? No, science is looking at this thing because it's bleeding human blood. So they're looking at it. And now with DNA testing and everything, they can see that in that blood, it's missing something. This bleeding statue of Jesus, which I assume is plaster, but it's missing something in its blood. It's missing Dad. They can see Mom in the DNA, but they can't see the Father. So they compared that to the Eucharistic miracles. And in case you don't know, similar story goes here, where when they look at the blood of like a bleeding host, they see that, yeah, there's Mom, but there's no Dad. If there was a Dad, then we'd know these Eucharistic miracles are a fraud. They're a fake. It's not Jesus, because we know Jesus. We know there was Mary, and we know Dad was in a little higher place, shall we say, right? And so it confirms our faith at Mass. This is my body. This is my blood. That's what the priest says, and so science is confirming what we know. So in talking to Ron Tesoriero, and he's saying that now the next step, and he's written to Pope Francis about this. This is what he wants to do next. He wants access to the Shroud of Turin, the supposed burial cloth of Jesus, because we have someone here who died 2,000 years ago. We have the wounds of Christ, right? We have blood that is caked onto this. But what if that blood, when tested, they found the same DNA? What if they found those same characteristics? There's Mom, but can't find a human Dad in all this. Wow, right? Wow. In a church that's trying to convince its members that the Eucharist is Jesus Christ, and 70% say, no, it's not. Boy, slam dunk here, right? Slam dunk. So I get excited about these kinds of stories. That's why I bring them up so often, because this is what brought me back to the church. This is why I ache so much when I don't see the church sharing my enthusiasm. Did I just change the syllable on that one? I think I did. Enthusiasm. It doesn't seem to be jumping up and down with me. We've got all this manna just raining down from heaven, this grace of science, right? That excites me, and that's why I ache. It's what brought me back. Because to me, in my former self, God was just old and boring, and Jesus was a younger version of being old and boring. And wow, God speak loudly, boldly, clearly, emphatically in these miraculous things happening. And so my heart just kind of races. Because otherwise, if all this is nonsense, if all this is, what have we actually been worshiping a loaf of bread, for the last 2,000 years? Science would indicate, no, that we have it right. Got a Mom, got Mary. Where's Dad? You have the Annunciation in a bleeding Jesus statue, in a bleeding host. That's so loudly, boldly, clearly God is speaking, right? So, and again, if you've heard this before, well, of course you remember, because you can't unlearn this. And if it's the first time you heard it, it's just kind of like, wow, why don't I know this? So picture the 10-year-old now, 10-year-old, receiving the Eucharist. And he's being told, by the way, there's this interesting things going on with some Eucharists here and there over the years. And in fact, there's a series actually over the last 4 or 5 Eucharistic miracles where they've really checked into the blood, the DNA, where they see this. And of course, this bleeding statue. And it's like, okay, if you hear that when you're 10 and again when you're 12 and maybe when you're 15, when you're 21 and sitting in the college classroom, the one that's trying to tell you there is no God. Yeah, but what about that blood thing? You can't unlearn it. Doesn't the world need to know this? Who's telling them? So I was asking a priest friend of mine, I said, what do you think Paul would do if he came back today? St. Paul, if he came back today and his job is to give the homily on, say, Christmas or Easter, when the CEOs are there, the Christmas, Easter only. So you basically have a church probably filled with mostly people who don't believe the Eucharist is Jesus. What would Paul do with that? What do you think he would do with that? Would he do the kumbaya thing, or would he get a little under their skin? Hey, what do you find under skin? Blood. I imagine him telling them all of this. I imagine him telling him from the beginning to now and all the evidence that there is. I'm picturing, just jumped into the road to Emmaus. Remember when Jesus comes up to those two and he says, let me explain this to you a little bit here. Let me explain what's been going on. It was kind of like, oh, and their eyes were opened. That's what I think Paul would do. And I imagine a church congregation leaving the church buzzing. Did you hear that? Had you ever heard that before about the blood thing? Wow. Maybe are they talking about this in church? Maybe we should come back more often. I'm imagining that. I'm imagining the buzz, the excitement, Manna. This is all manna to me. This is all just manna. It's just still falling out of the heavens. These graces, this knowledge, this science and everything. Now, back in the old days, in the Israelite days, they got this manna every day for 40 years until they got to the promised land. And then it stopped. Didn't need it anymore. They were in the land of milk and honey. Same for us. Manna from heaven, living bread from heaven. Every day we have access to Jesus in the Eucharist. Isn't that amazing? Until we die and we get to the promised land, hopefully. And there he will be, smiling at us. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you for sending all the signs. Thank you for sending all the clues. Thank you for the manna. Thank you for all these miraculous things you have done. And just maybe one of the greatest miracles is maybe he saved till last about his blood, because that's why he came. He came to shed his precious blood. And there in his blood, look what's not there as a sign that he is here now, walking amongst us. Thanks, Jesus. And thank you for joining us this week on Men's Morning Light. See you next week.